Welcome to this Tech Meds for Wireheads course on Linux user management. My name is Rob Tracy, and I will be your instructor for this course. The goal of this course is to provide you with some basics as to how user accounts and passwords are managed on a Linux system. As such, we're going to cover the objectives listed on this slide in this lesson. First of all, by the time we're done with this lesson, you should be able to describe the role of the passwd and shadow files. You should be able to add a user from the shell prompt, and you should be able to manage passwords for your Linux user accounts from the shell prompt. Let's get going. Our first objective is to describe the role of the passwd and the shadow files. The first thing you need to understand is the fact that Linux is a true multi-user operating system. In other words, it's designed from the ground up to provide access to multiple users at the same time. As such, each individual user needs to have their own unique computing environment. Now, you access a Linux system by logging in using your username and password. And if you've ever worked on a Windows system before, which I assume most of you probably have, then you're already familiar with this concept. You log into Windows with your username and password, and you're provided with your own unique desktop, your own unique My Documents directory where you store your files and so on. Well, it works exactly the same way with Linux. When you log into Linux, you do so with your own unique user account and your own unique user account password, and your individual computing environment is created for you. And other users on the system do not have access to your computing environment in the file system. If you create a document and you save it in your area of the file system, other users don't have access to it unless you specifically grant them access to it. Okay, now when we create a user account on Linux, that user account is usually assigned a home directory. It doesn't have to be, but it usually is. And this home directory is created by default in the /home directory. And your unique home directory is named after your username in /home. And you can take a look down at the example at the bottom of the screen. And you can see that I'm logged into this Linux system, and I've logged in as my Tracy user. You can tell by looking at the shell prompt. It starts out with rtracy @ and then the name of the host that I'm logged into. And then I entered the pwd command. Pwd stands for print working directory. It tells me where I'm at in the Linux file system. And you can see here that my current directory, my user's home directory, is /home/rtracy. Now, notice up in the command prompt, we have my username, and then the @ sign, and then the name of the host, like we talked about a second ago, where I'm logged in, and then a colon, and then a tilde. Now, that tilde is very special. The tilde indicates the current user's home directory. It's like a shortcut. I'm logged in as rtracy, therefore the tilde is a shortcut for /home/rtracy. If I were logged in as a different user, say K Sanders, then the tilde would reference K Sanders' home directory, which would probably be /home/K Sanders. Now, within each user's home directory are usually a series of subdirectories that are created to organize each user's files. Now, the actual directories that are created will vary a little bit from distribution to distribution. The most common ones are listed here on this slide. First of all, within our home directory, we have a subdirectory named desktop. These are the files that appear on our graphical desktop. And I want to point out one more thing here. Notice that desktop begins with a capital D. You must remember, and this is a hard thing for folks when they're coming from the Windows world into the Linux world. In Windows, path names, file names are not case sensitive. In Linux, they are very case sensitive. Now, most distributions will also provide each user with a document directory in their home directory, and usually it's named document, again with a capital D. And you can see an example of this down below. In the example below, where I've used the ls command for list files, and you can see that I have my desktop directory, and I also have a documents directory, and documents is a place where you save your documents. In addition, most Linux distributions will provide you with a web page directory named public_HTML. This is a very useful directory. You can save HTML files here, and if your Linux system has a web server such as Apache running, then those files that you save in that directory are accessible through the Apache web server. In other words, it's a way for you to publish your own web pages. And most distributions will also provide you with an executable directory It's usually in your home directory. It's usually named bin, and you can see the bin directory in the example down there. This is where you put files or executable files that you want to be able to run from the command prompt. Why? Because the bin home directory is in your path environment variable. Therefore, if you drop an executable in the bin subdirectory, you can run it from wherever you're at in the file system without having to explicitly specify the path where it resides. There's a couple other directories you can see here. Now these may and may not be created depending on which distribution you're using. We have music, we have public, we have templates, we have download, pictures, and so on. Those are more distribution dependent. I'm using OpenSUSE 11.2 here, and it creates those directories for me. Again, those are just a way for you to organize your users' personal files. The one exception to this rule is the root user's home directory. Remember, root is the super administrative user of the Linux system. Root does not have a home directory in /home. The root user's home directory resides in a special directory called /root. With this in mind, let's now discuss where your Linux user accounts are stored in the system. There are actually many different options for storing Linux user accounts, and these are listed here on the screen. The first option, and the most commonly used option, is local. With the local option, your Linux user accounts are stored in the /etc, which we affectionately call the etc directory, in the passwd file, and your passwords are actually stored in a separate file called shadow in the same directory. We'll talk about how that works a little bit later on. And like I said before, this is the default configuration. It's been used by Linux systems for years. This is probably what you'll run into most of the time. However, there are other options. One option that is becoming more and more popular is the LDAP option, in which case an open LDAP directory service is installed on the system, and your user accounts are stored in the directory service. It also allows you to store your user accounts on one Linux system in your network, and then have all your other Linux systems redirect authentication attempts to that system, so you store your user accounts in one central location. Very powerful. Similarly, you can also use NIS. NIS stands for Network Information Service. It's designed to provide centralized user account management. It's very useful if you have multiple systems that all need to use the same user accounts, kind of like we talked about with LDAP. Another option, which I haven't seen implemented a lot, but which is kind of interesting and powerful, is domain. You can actually configure your Linux system to authenticate users against an existing Windows domain. Now, the LDAP option is really cool. It's very powerful. However, it's much more complex, and so we're not going to go into it here. We'll save that for a different lesson. Now, in this course, we're going to focus on the local option, where we will look at user accounts that are stored in a local file in the file system. With this in mind, let's look at how Linux user accounts are stored if we use the local option, where we store them in the local file system. In your Linux file system, there's a subdirectory off the root called etc, which, as I said before, we affectionately refer to as the etc directory. In this directory are 4 different files that control authentication to your Linux system, and these are listed on the slide. The first one is the passwd. Sometimes we call it the password file, but I don't like doing it because, well, it doesn't contain any passwords. All it contains is user account information. The passwd file contains user account information, the definitions for the user accounts on your system. The shadow file in the same directory, however, actually stores the passwords for the user accounts that you define in the passwd file. And likewise, on a Linux system, we can create groups and assign multiple users to various groups. It allows us to ease administration if we need to provide access to a large number of users to the same file or directory in the file system. It's much easier to assign that access privilege to a group rather than having to do it multiple times for each individual user that needs access. Your group definitions are also defined in a file in the /etc directory. The file is named group. And if you assign passwords to your groups, those passwords are stored in the gshadow file, also in the etc directory.